Very good. Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Zach, and thanks to Georgina and Zach for, this is the fourth one of these conferences I've attended, and I think it's the second one you've given me the permission to speak at, so thank you for entertaining my strange ideas, and today will be kind of no exception. Another strange idea for the Robert Menzies Institute on the topic of managed decolonisation. So, from the 1960s, as the British Empire faded from Australia's region, the recolonisation of former imperial possessions became politically unpalatable and practically unfeasible. In response, the Australian government turned its attention to what I've decided to call the managed decolonisation of former Western territories in the Asia Pacific. For British-administered territories, including Australia's, the process was focused on gradually creating economically viable, politically friendly, liberal democratic nations that would remain within the Commonwealth family. The process was unashamedly paternalistic, and for many of the local nationalists in these territories, frustratingly slow. Managed decolonisation would leverage international financial institutions and UN organs to give a degree of guidance to transitioning territories and to associate the whole process to UN aims so as to dampen anti-colonial criticism. However, knowing that the Australian government alone would have limited influence in this process, in these projects, and wanting to particularly focus on the managed decolonisation of its neighbouring territories, in the early 1960s, Australia looked to draw in American interest in the transition of the territories in the Pacific when the British Commonwealth had assessed, which the British Commonwealth had assessed as underprepared for independence. So to kind of give a bit of a historical kind of context leading up to this policy of managed decolonisation, we have this concept of the Pacific Empire at the heart of Australian policy up until this point. Very much kind of born from Alfred Deakin's view that Australia should have a larger role in guiding the direction and administration of British territories in the Pacific, and his pursuit as well to draw in American power into the region to really underscore the sense that the region would be guided by Western aspirations for development. And that's kind of borne out by what many of you would be aware of, the visit of the Great White Fleet, and other efforts to try and bring in American power. And it should be noted that much of the annexation of Pacific territories kind of leading up to Federation had been very championed and led by Australia and New Zealand as well. Britain had at times been quite lukewarm on the expansion of British territories in the region, but Australia and New Zealand had really pushed it. Jumping forward to the process after the Great War, Billy Hughes had been very forward-leaning in wanting Australia to acquire territories in the post-war settlement. And he and Joseph Lyons had continued this idea of bringing in the Americans as well with that concept of the Pacific Pact. And lest this be perceived as a centre-right aspiration, you see in John Curtin's post-war address during the war, late war address in December 1943, advocating the recolonisation of territories in what he called a kind of Fourth Empire phase, a rejuvenation of British power in the region after the war and as part of that settlement. And then we have, during the Malayan emergency, the creation of the ANZAM grouping of Australia, New Zealand and Malaya. Again, another planning body to try and bring in and sustain Western power in the future of these regions, of these countries in the Pacific. So just a quick comment on Menzies in the Pacific. This whole idea of the Pacific Empire would not have been kind of anathema to him. That would have been quite uncontroversial to his cabinet colleagues as well. He first brushed up, I suppose, with the challenges of sustaining Western power in the Pacific when he becomes Prime Minister for the first time and is confronted with the frailties of the Singapore strategy that we all know kind of collapsed and underpinned much of the failures of the Second World War. We also have in the post-war environment as well, Menzies being very supportive of Portuguese reoccupation of Timor, and there's even assessments at the time that suggest that Australia would be willing to underwrite Portuguese and other colonial powers returning to the region. And just for this discussion of managed decolonisation, the relevant ministers that are in his orbit here are Minister for External Affairs, Garfield Barwick, who is Minister for External Affairs, and then we have Paul Hasluck as well for territories. So just a quick kind of context there. So getting as well to what generates this policy of managed decolonisation is really the birth of a regional consciousness for Australia. With the drawback of British power in the region, you have this gradual psychological shift amongst Australian politicians and strategy makers that they need to find security within Asia rather than security from Asia. You have the CEDAW experiment kicked off in 1955 to generate a kind of concept of regional multilateralism to underwrite security. And we also have in 1966, a bit later, the creation of the Asian and Pacific Council, which ends up being a bit of a failed experiment, but is nevertheless an important body because of the fact that it's a regional grouping in which Australia is present in the region without the UK and the US as well. And as many of you know, we also have later, after Menzies with Holt, the dismantling of the White Australia policy, again kind of recognising that Australia is part of the region. So that's an important psychological shift that's in the background here as we talk about managed decolonisation. In terms of the politics of decolonisation generally, that map kind of shows you a bit of a sense of, at the end of World War II, the demarcation of the territories amongst the powers, with a lot of red and green there indicating territories that have been essentially recolonised or reoccupied. And Australia's priority was very much to swiftly reoccupy the Papua New Guinean territories and to ensure, as I mentioned, the reintroduction of the Portuguese into Timor. And there is this overriding objective as well to entangle Britain and the US in the region, to make sure that there is not a withdrawal of Western power and to check that anti-colonial narrative that's emerging within the United Nations. So, as a result, Australia is trying to build a policy consensus with the British and Americans on how to handle the development of these territories. This is reflected in an exchange of letters from 1962 between Australia's relevant ministers, Barwick and Hasluck. In their exchange, Barwick explains to Hasluck that there should be a consensus between Australians, British and Americans on how to handle the development of dependent territories in order to head off, quote, powerful and critical inquiries from the UN in which Australia could otherwise find itself very much alone. Australia therefore adopted a policy of only supporting the establishment of states believed to be sustainable and that would not be subject to internal security crises or become sources of regional insecurity themselves. This gradualist attitude was intended not to contradict American policies, which were far more cool on the prospect of relinquishing territories. The United States observed closely the decolonisation policies being developed by the UK, New Zealand and Australia during the early 1960s, because if the British world were to be swifter or less conditional in its approach to granting independence, it could, quote, complicate the US exercise of swallowing US territories into the United States. And that's particularly in relation to Guam and American Samoa. So accordingly, the Australian government in the 1960s was willing to move slowly on the question of PNG's self-determination so as to not accelerate the international trend of decolonisation to a point that would make it uncomfortable for the Americans. So that said, Menzies' cabinet did not want to sit on their hands when it came to the question of decolonisation. Australia saw an opportunity to instigate a more favourable security environment if the Americans were undisrupted in their efforts to incorporate their Pacific territories into the United States. With an unpredictable and somewhat hostile Indonesian neighbour now sharing a land border with Australia and a northern region under threat of communist insurgency, the Australian government mused that the American retention and consolidation of its Pacific territories may be a favourable step towards the maintenance, if not expansion, of American power in the region. As one secret government briefing in 1962 explained, quote, if the Americans accomplish the incorporation of the Trust Territory in the United States, American soil will be less than 200 miles from Indonesian territory, and a line of islands, part of the United States, will run some 1,000 miles north of New Guinea. So the Australian government therefore believed that if the process of decolonisation in the Pacific could be handled deftly and in close coordination with the United States, Australia could not only maintain the security status quo, but possibly realise opportunities for, quote, reinforcing and consolidating our security relationship with the United States through arrangements embracing the Pacific relationship with the United States. Embracing the Pacific territories in the north and east of Australia. The holy grail of such a reinforcement was obviously to expand the ANZUS guarantee, something that was a realistic aspiration at the time, given that in 1962 Australia had received, quote, reaffirmation of the application of ANZUS to Papua and New Guinea. So, turning to this policy of managed decolonisation. In the 1960s, policies of recolonisation were replaced with what my paper will call policies of managed decolonisation, and this is very much first formalised in the recommendations of the 1962 South Pacific Study. The South Pacific Study Group provided the basis for Australia's first policies of managed decolonisation and proved particularly useful for maintaining an Anglo-American consensus on the development of the territories. Barwick was the Australian government's chief advocate for this idea of managed decolonisation during his time in office and believed firmly that to, quote, keep Oceania free or relatively free of Chinese and communist influence, end quote, Australia needed to get the United States government invested in the managed transition of regional territories, particularly in the South Pacific. To this end, Barwick's delegation to the 1962 ANZUS meeting successfully argued the need for a more concerted approach by the ANZUS countries towards the decolonisation of the South Pacific, and the meeting established a four-power South Pacific Study Group to investigate the challenges and opportunities involved in the South Pacific's decolonisation and to review options for a coordinated policy approach between Australia, America, New Zealand and the UK. The study group principally recommended that while the governments should support in-principle independence for Pacific territories, in the short term, quote, administering powers should plan for a status less than sovereign independence, end quote, for most of the region, except for those territories the study group believed could handle self-determination, these being Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, Fiji and Tonga. It proposed, quote, other solutions that hinted at federating smaller territories via a gradual path to statehood involving, quote, integration, free association and transfers of sovereignty with the consent of all people concerned. These other solutions would allow the UK and America in particular to offer territories steps towards nationhood that would satisfy UN critics, but in a managed way that would not compromise important strategic installations in these territories, such as the facilities being used for joint nuclear surveillance and space projects. The study group also made the case for building institutions of Pacific regionalism, stating that, quote, the development of wider and at the same time tighter groupings presents one possibility of making the territories more viable and hence more stable and of building up their resistance to outside pressures. However, it would not be until the emergence of the South Pacific Forum in 1971 that the Australian government felt comfortable enough to support Pacific states supplanting Western association with self-initiated regionalism. So in 1963, when he presented the study group's report, Barwick explained to his cabinet colleagues that the study group had achieved Australia's, quote, final objective to induce US interest in the South Pacific area. The Australian government's success in this regard was to use the spectre of communist states arising in the Pacific to link the decolonisation of the South Pacific to America's Cold War strategic interests. This allowed Australia to overcome the previous prevailing American opinion that responsibility for the future of former colonies rested with the paternal state, in the South Pacific's case being mostly the UK and European countries. As Christopher Waters has explained, Cabinet was uneasy with Barwick's enthusiasm to allow the study group to drive multilateral policy planning between the four countries, but it did nevertheless endorse the study group's recommendations, quote, as broad guidelines for Australian policy in the Pacific and as the basis for further exchanges with our allies. The Australian government's proactive engagement with the 1962 South Pacific Study Group and its gradual integration of many of the group's policy recommendations into its own approach marked, in my view, the end of recolonisation in the psyche of Australian internationalism. While an embrace of constructive decolonisation had been percolating for at least the previous decade, the South Pacific Study Group marked the first occasion that the Australian government adopted a coherently devised policy for managed decolonisation rather than retention within the empire. This is not to say that the Australian government was eager to accelerate the decolonisation or anti-colonialism, as it was referred to in Cabinet. Views persisted in the 1960s that if decolonisation of Western territories in the region was to occur, it should be done in a gradual, managed approach. Then Treasurer Harold Holt reflected this prevailing view when he remarked to Cabinet in 1962 that, quote, "time is on our side in colonial questions." He even cast doubt on the potency of independence movements themselves, stating that the fashion of independence may not be the fashion in the future. In the end, the study group's recommendations proved influential upon the United States' own policies as well towards decolonisation in the Pacific, with the following recommendations being adopted as American policy. Firstly, the US State Department accepted the, quote, "administering powers should plan for a status less than sovereign independence for the Pacific territories, except possibly in the case of the larger territories, such as Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, Fiji, and Tonga." Secondly, they adopted the recommendation that the recommended preference for, quote, "treaty relationships, providing for the former administering power to look after the defence and foreign relations in the new nation." And thirdly, they accepted that independence should only be allowed to progress in circumstances that would not place in jeopardy the security of the region. So in terms of questions that I think need to be answered in the final version of my paper, what I still need to understand in more detail is Menzies' own personal role in this policy. How decisive was he? His approach to Cabinet government meant that he was quite happy with something of a team of rivals, very large and dominant personalities who were steeped within their policy expertise. Certainly that was the case with Hasluck and with Barwick, who very, very principally drove this policy development alongside Holt. But it should be noted that after Menzies did depart Cabinet, these policies accelerated in his absence. Another question I want to explore in greater depth was how disruptive was Holt's death to the continuity of this policy. Holt, upon becoming Prime Minister, had been very forward-leaning in emphasising that regional consciousness I spoke about before. He embarked on a very wide-ranging tour of the region in 1967, which blitzed a number of countries in Southeast Asia. So he was clearly very passionate about demonstrating to the region that Australia had kind of turned over a new leaf, but how much was his departure from the scene disruptive to the continuity of managed decolonisation? And the other question I want to explore in more depth was what were Labor's attitudes to this at the time? Because obviously we know that upon becoming Prime Minister, Whitlam accelerates these processes much, much faster than the Australian government had previously anticipated. But had that been the view prior to his arrival on the scene as well? So those are some things that I'm going to continue kind of working on in the final version. But thank you for your attention and happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Will, for a really interesting paper. First question is, do you know if the Melbourne academic and political scientist William McMahon Ball had any input into this strategy and paper, or whether he was a critic of it?
I'm not sure, to be entirely honest. So this paper is born out of to be quite frank, born out of a chapter in my PhD thesis that I wrote about 4 or 5 years ago. So my memory of the specific notes around the members of the study group I need to return to, but it's certainly worth investigating because, as you know, he was incredibly influential on many of these people. Yeah.
Thanks, Will. That was wonderful. I don't know whether it's just an effect of the material you've selected, but the impression that one gets is that the policymakers were looking at strategic interests of various sorts and were very sensitive to British opinion and American opinion and UN opinion. Was anyone caring about the opinions of the people in these territories themselves?
Yeah.
Did the policymakers actually think about what do the Papua New Guineans want, what do the Tongans want, what do the Fijians want? Because that didn't come through at all, and I'm wondering whether it is actually there.
No, I think it's fair to say that those views were being deprioritised. The fact that Barwick chooses a meeting of the ANZUS leaders as the basis of the South Pacific Study Group, kind of tells you everything you need to know about which institutions they think are important in terms of developing this policy consensus. And certainly the policy recommendations of the study group are not circulated with locals, for example. So I think it's not an unfair assessment to say that they were being sidelined.
Frank and then Nick.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot, Will. Your framework was strategic. That is, the drivers are seen to be the Cold War, strategic calculations of one kind or another. I wondered what role, if any, commercial considerations and pressures play in all this. I mean, Australia's had what you might call a commercial empire in the Pacific, including PNG, stretching back to, well, the early 19th century, actually. So I just wondered, this is a period of intensification of phosphate mining and all the rest of it. In a country where there's a coalition government involving the Country Party, agricultural expansion in Australia in the 1950s and 60s. So I just wondered what role, if any, commercial considerations are playing in this, or commercial pressures, perhaps, as much as anything.
Yeah, it's a really pertinent observation and probably a lens that needs to be applied in the final paper, because you're absolutely right. Those commercial pressures certainly drive from the earliest days of Australia's interest in these territories. They're there in the front of mind when Deakin is encouraging the British to take a more proactive role in securing the New Hebrides at the time, and Fiji as well. So I think it's absolutely a factor, and certainly one that, I probably need to pay more attention to.
Nick and then George.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Building partly on what Frank said, I think it would be worth, in the final paper, really developing what is specifically South Pacific about this interest, just from a couple of perspectives. I mean, the Menzies cabinet, and certainly the cabinet as a whole, is very divided about the pace with which the possible independence of Papua New Guinea is being debated. That's not a foregone conclusion, certainly early in this period, and certainly coming out of the Hasluck period, there's a lot of debate about that within the government as well as outside. But also, it seems to me that in managing the United States, I'm partly thinking of the conflict between Australia and the United States over the future of Dutch New Guinea. The United States' interest in decolonisation is also highly strategic, and what they might be wanting to hold on to in strategic terms, in terms of their own interests in the South Pacific, is very different to, in the sense, what they're prepared to trade off in securing other alliances in Southeast Asia.
I agree. I think this is where the use of the phrase "the Pacific in the ANZUS Treaty" is quite interesting, because the concept of the Pacific is deliberately nebulous. It's kind of used as a regional grouping that at times in the imagination of policymakers is either very, very specific when it needs to be, or very, very wide-ranging when it's more suitable. So, yeah.
Will, leaving aside New Guinea and just concentrating on the small Pacific Island states, these are all British colonies and dependencies. To what extent was Australian government policy influenced by what the government of the United Kingdom wanted to do, particularly given the election of the Wilson government in 1964 and its acceleration of the decolonisation policies, which really are traceable back to the Macmillan government? I mean, were we under pressure? Was the Australian government under pressure, particularly after 1964, to accelerate decolonisation?
I think the pressure was manifesting it was manifesting more through the absence of a policy position on the British part than rather a firm lobbying, in the sense that the signals were being sent for a very long time, particularly after the Suez crisis, that Britain was going to be withdrawing, and obviously that culminates in the East of Suez withdrawal in '66, and you have the exchange of letters between Wilson and Holt, and Wilson's giving these reassurances to Holt that don't worry, even though we're not going to be taking a proactive role in the wider security of the region, we will always protect and reinforce Australia's security. And Holt's kind of return serve in his letters is saying, you're missing the point. I'm not concerned about Australia's security. I am concerned about the wider region and the presence of British power in the region writ large. So I think this recognition of Menzies' cabinet and then Holt's cabinet that they need to have some proactive policies on this is recognising the fact that the British are French exiting out the back door, quietly, and that they need to have a plan in place. So in that sense, it's kind of quite prescient, I suppose, to be developing these policies. Yeah.
Quickly, last question, certainly.
Thanks. Just the other dimension that is of interest, I think, in terms of pressures is what's happening in the UN, and especially for Australia in the Trusteeship Council, being a trusteeship power in New Guinea, and also with the UK and New Zealand in Nauru, and the various UN visits that are sent to those islands during that period, some of which are led by friendly people like Britain's Sir Hugh Foote in the early 60s, which is an important visit, and he has some very interesting discussions with people in the Menzies government, especially Hasluck, about what's happening in the UN. And of course, Hasluck brings his own UN background and experience to bear on all of that discussion. So I just think that's an interesting dimension in it all.
Yes, certainly the external pressure of the politics happening inside the UN is, like, the Australian government gets the impression that there is a clock ticking down on this, and that unless they are trying to get ahead of it and proactive in trying to be seen to be responding to the changing mores, I suppose, within the UN, that they will get overtaken by decolonisation politics that's arising in the UN, particularly from the third world or the developing world. Very good. Thank you, Zach.